years, it was that music and the Good Morning Nova Scotia that greeted listeners across the region. Rick Howe was a broadcasting icon, a legend in many ways. And as I found out this morning, as many of you did, he had passed away at the age of 69 after a long battle with cancer. In fact, it was that diagnosis a few years ago that led to him hanging up the headphones, so to speak, just shy of 50 years behind the microphone here in Atlantic Canada. I'd reached out to a former colleague of his, a friend, Steve Murphy. You may know him from CTV, and unable to join me to talk directly to Rick Howe, he did send me this statement, which reads, Rick Howe was an original, outspoken, often controversial, but never unkind. In fact, he was a man of extraordinary good nature who advocated for truth and was a voice for justice and completely authentic. What you heard was who he was. He was also a persistent reporter with an knack for getting to the heart of the matter. As Steve Murphy says, I've known Rick since I was 16. He was 21. I thought he was old. He's 47 years. He was an early mentor and teacher and might not have had the career without his encouragement and guidance. He was a very good man. Sympathy to Yvonne and their family. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts, and I also wanted to hear from someone else who worked closely with Rick Howe over the years. This is That Conversation. This is my podcast. This is Thinking Out Loud. I'm Sheldon McLoud. The things that most people probably didn't know about Rick Howe, his real first name was Eric. His tagline, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, he borrowed that from the Raging Grannies. And what was most surprising of all is how deep his love for Yvonne went. He called her every single morning before he went on the air. And I know a lot of people knew the public persona of Rick Howe, but he was a very private man. And J.C. Douglas, thank you for speaking to me about Rick Howe. How long did you work with Rick?
Yes, and also the Expos. Don't forget the Expos. Loved and still has loved the Expos. I've seen his bobblehead collection. It's amazing. How long did I? Probably about a dozen years, I think, at the Pink Palace when he was working for the Chum stations and I was working with Newcap. But we worked together very closely. Got a couple of stories. I'll get into that.
And I got to know him at a different point of his career. In fact, he interviewed me when he was working at CJCH. So that was the first time I ever had real contact with him. I knew him through RTNDA or RTDNA. And then when he and I were working briefly together at 95.7 around 2010, it was after CJCH had closed. So he was working as a reporter very briefly. And then in 2014, the company asked me to fill in for him in the summer for his 2-week vacation. So that's really when I first got to meet Rick Howe. What was your first impression of him?
My first impression of Rick was not good. Because I think before I knew him really as a professional, I knew him on the ice and on the ball field. And he was a very competitive baseball player and a tough hockey player, even though I think he was like 95 years old at the time. At least he looked it. He was the only one on the CJCH team with gray hair, or gray on the sides anyway. And I was the young buck, and he was a tough so-and-so. And yeah, but I mean, that's the way he played. He played the way he directed news. You know, he was tough and he was competitive. And later, of course, I got to love him for all that. But at first, it was like, yeah, I don't love like that Howe guy. So funny to think back on that.
And there was rivalry. He, as you mentioned, he was fiercely competitive, but he had a tremendous love for the job, for radio. It was his passion. There was no question about it.
Oh my God, yeah, it's funny. He showed me a photo one time of him with tremendously long hair, I think it was a northern New Brunswick radio station, maybe CKBC in Bathurst or something like that, as a black and white photo of him behind the board as a rock and roll disc jockey. And I remember bugging him for air checks, and I never did hear an air check of him. I would love to have heard Rick Howe on the air doing the rock and roll thing.
One thing I'll guarantee you, it is somewhere in a box in his home, because he was a self-effect pack rat, and that's what.
Yes, I've seen some of his collections, but it's funny that hasn't come up. I have to bug Yvonne at some point in the future about air checks from Rick.
He had this. He had a wealth of knowledge about a lot of things, and he had a huge a number of contacts in the industry. In fact, he had this duotang filled with phone numbers and contact information. We jokingly referred to it as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he held on to that. And he would go, "Oh, I've got that person's phone number." He was just amazing that way. He'd remember people's phone numbers. And one of the things that was most surprising, I think, for most, is that doing an early morning talk show, he would call people. He'd wait, but he'd call people at 6 o'clock in the morning and say, "Hey, will you be ready to come on the show later today?" And just the dedication to the profession.
Yeah, he was incredibly well prepared, and I think that was what. One time I saw him vulnerable, which is one thing you don't see a lot from Rick Howe, was when he was considering taking over the talk show, and I think it might have been from Brian Phillips at that point on CJCH, and he was like, I don't know if I'm prepared to handle a discussion of any topic at any time. And I said, man, I know few people more prepared to do that than you. And I was glad he went ahead and did it, because that was a real, this market needed a host like yourself and like Rick Howe on the radio doing the talk show thing. By the way, Montreal Expo's clock, I thought I'd just show that off as well. He'd be very proud of me.
Montreal Canadiens, Montreal. Look at that. Even has his switch.
I can't wear Canadian stuff. I'm being a.
You're a Bruins fan.
Being a Bruin fan.
Yeah,
I
diehard.
can't wear the Canadiens paraphernalia, but the Expos, yes, we're good.
One of the many, I guess, stories or perspectives that Rick brought was that he himself would say, you never know what is going to excite people, inflame people, or encourage them to be a part of the conversation. And he was so good at that. In fact, I was working with him when he decided to go with a 1-hour talk show every single day, where he would have people calling in. And some days it would be the entire show. And just the way that people responded to him. I was just curious about how you feel, because we have gone through a transition. We have seen a change in the medium and the way that people interact with it. What does that say to you about the person that Rick Howe was?
Well, you mentioned the outrage line, which I used to poke him for, because I thought the way things are becoming, I think we need less outrage and more reasoned debate. But he was kind of like, nah, it's showbiz. And I appreciate that. I really do. And he made it it's funny, because when I would get off the air on C100 and drive home, I'd always be thinking, I'm going to listen to the new album by whomever. And I'd always get stuck listening to his talk show, because once it was on, and it was on in the radio, I couldn't turn it off. It was always gripping. And yeah, I loved it when he got feisty. I'd always text him or email him and say, I love the outraged Rick Howe. Keep giving me that outraged Rick Howe. And occasionally I'd send him other little points and stuff like that. And I would love to hear it weaved into the conversation in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I thought, that's cool. You never credited me, but it was always fun to hear something like that. But yeah, I think he was a man of the people, really. And he liked to hear all sides debated, but he was very good at making his case for what he believed in. And the man, he's the kind of guy who would fight for justice. And I love that about him.
You mentioned something that I did hear from him directly, which was it's showbiz first, but the passion that undercut that was the foundation of every single conversation he had. And he did have a passion for politics, which is, I think in some cases lost on people these days, how much of a commitment he had to talking about politics, empowering people, and holding the powerful to account. Yeah,
it's interesting, because the last few years, when we've visited mostly at his home down the South Shore, he and Yvonne just picked out a lovely spot right across from the the ocean, and it was just a beautiful spot for him to spend his recovery time. And whenever I'd visit, man, we would get into the longest discussions on politics, and he was just as feisty and as passionate about it as ever, which was wonderful. He never lost that. But and I was just listening to him and Steve Murphy talk, to Steve Murphy talk on the talk show a few minutes ago. You were talking about the Mass Casualty Commission, and that's something that Rick and I spent a lot of time talking about. And I know he was in touch a lot with Paul Palango, and he may have had some influence in that commission actually coming about, which I thought was absolutely fantastic on his side. I mean, that he advocated for the families of those victims, and that's the kind of thing that, I mean, Rick just felt it would be so. How could this province not push to the nth degree? There's never going to be hopefully a worse story than that out of this province. So, I mean, the very least he could do was advocate for them to at least get a commission. I know he was a little disappointed with its outcome, really, I think, in the end. His passion, boy, here's a story from our Newcap days, because it was a short period of time when the talk show on CJCH had moved over to 780 Kicks Country, the AM station, the Newcap AM station that I was programming at the time. And this is 2001. And because I think CJCH had become the Team 920. And so there was no room really for a hotline show on it, a non-sports show on it. And so I was his boss, sort of. And on the day of 9/11, and before his talk show went to air, which was, I think, around noon or 1 p.m. at the time, I'd been getting a fair amount of pressure, particularly from the other side of the hall, to watch how incendiary Rick's show would get that day. I think they were nervous that callers would start talking in racist terms, because that sort of, presented itself that day. And we had no idea what was going to happen on 9/11. I mean, everybody was like braced because something more could go down. And they were afraid that, this would lead to some kind of turmoil right here in the city or what have you. So I took to Rick the decision that we weren't going to take any calls from callers that day. It would be a news and information program that day, more so than a caller feedback and interactive show. And he was not happy with me. And that's the one thing he held against me for years and years. And I remember saying to him at one point, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, that, Rick, I have to apologize for that day because it was the wrong decision. Absolutely the wrong decision. I know you would have handled it professionally, and you would have known exactly where to and how far to go. And the fact that I, who had no knowledge of the news business, stopped that from happening. I was sorry about that, and he was very good about it. He didn't mention. I don't think he mentioned me by name and mouthed off about that in his first book. He only mentioned about us having water gun fights in the hallway. So that was. That was good. I like that.
He did talk about how it didn't, it wasn't as much fun as it was back in the day. And I think that's a perspective a lot of people will bring to a lot of different medium or careers, is that, when everybody's on the rise, everybody's trying to get together and everything's running on all cylinders. And there was time to have a bit of fun. It's a business now. It's a serious business, but he still took some time to find the glimmer, the high spots, or forever in search of the best club sandwich. Forever.
Oh my God! Where what he introduced to me for club sandwiches was the Westcliff Diner on Bears Road.
Yep.
Because he loved the floor show of the husband and wife, who probably still run the place, and would just squabble at each other at full volume the entire time you're there for lunch, which I really appreciate him doing that. I got to take other friends there because that's very entertaining. And I thank Rick for that.
And knowing Rick, it probably didn't hurt that it's probably one of the most affordable places in the city.
True.
Yeah. The money he didn't spend on wardrobe.
Yeah. Good
just
point.
just a good soul. And I don't know if is there a final thing you want to say, or a memory you have, or perhaps something that,
Oh my God.
I know I hate to put you on the spot, but you've been along.
Just it's funny because he's a private guy, and I don't think so.
Yeah, I hear you. JC Douglas, thank you for this.
I want to listen just to Yvonne and their extended family. All the best. I will be down before too long to see those folks. And we lost a good one. Yeah,
great.
We it's been a tough year so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I my takeaway, and I mentioned this to someone else in the business this morning, is that you need to just follow some of Rick's direction. Do what you love for as long as you can, but don't wait till you retire to chase your dreams. And I think
he got a lot out of life. He did, and I think he feels that he's lived a good one. So yeah, absolutely.
JC Douglas, thank you.
Thanks, pal. Have a good day.
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it again tomorrow. Hope you'll join us. Same bad time, same bad channel. For Jennifer Casey, I'm Rick Howe. Have a great night. And remember, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention.